Welcome to Discover with Andre, episode 2. I'm really happy to continue doing this series, and today we have a very special guest, one of my really great friends and my roommate, Justin Soto Garcia. He's the Director of Cultural Affairs for LSA. He's involved in clubs such as Brothers Breaking Bread, Acción Latinx, and this year Film and TV Writers SEA. He's born in the Dominican Republic, he's raised in New York City, and he's got a film major, but he's also got a business minor. So that's our guest today, Justin Soto. How you doing, bud?
Hey, how you doing, roommate? I just saw you this morning.
Yeah, we do live together. But I wanted to change the topic this week to include, more of a Latin taste. Today is my parents' country's Independence Day. Got to shout them out, Viva la Raza. But also, the other day was the Independence Days of a lot of Central American indigenous peoples. So, I want to give them a shout out to them too. But we're going to take this turn right now. We're just going to immediately go into the questions. Justin, what does it mean to be Afro-Latino? And before you get into that, maybe kind of explain what Afro-Latino is and kind of the history behind that.
Okay, so I've actually been reading this academic book that I got last year called the Afro-Latino Reader, that was kind of written by 2 NYU professors that I heard about a while ago. So I've actually been learning a lot about the history of not only African influences across Latin America, but how in conjunction they relate to the Black community across the African diaspora, with not only African Americans, but also in relation to Africans. But just to start off about my identity growing up Dominican, well, I was obviously born in DR in Santo Domingo, which is the capital of the country, and my parents moved to New York City when I was about 2 or 3 years old. So I was raised in New York, but I would go back to DR just about every summer when I was little. So also in New York, I was raised in the Heights. And for those of you who don't know about Washington Heights, we have a play named after us. It was basically an entire immigrant community, mainly comprised of Dominicans and then Puerto Ricans. So living in that immigrant community, even though I was here in the States, I was never exactly put in a position where I had to force myself to assimilate or be Americanized to a huge extent, which is a big contrast to a lot of other Latinos who may have grown up in rural or suburban areas across the States that might have not been surrounded by other people like them, which I know can have a huge effect on your way of living, how you grow up, knowing your culture. Yeah. But yeah, from that, I will say that growing up, I rejected a lot of my culture.
I think a lot of people from immigrant families can say the same about that.
That's very common, and that's an issue I've been really trying to touch upon, and as the Director of Cultural Affairs for the Latinx Student Assembly. It's that level of assimilation that happens over generations that's really becoming a huge issue as the Hispanic population in the States grows ever more. And as we're proliferating on a huge strands, and I think by 2050, the Latino population in the US is projected to be almost a quarter, as I've heard.
It's going to be 50% in the state.
Yeah, it's huge. So as it's getting bigger and bigger, other issues not only immigration, but some foreign language instruction in schools, and in terms of knowing retaining your culture and how that plays into your identity is becoming more and more important. And I'm kind of going away from me because I know you asked me the question in relation to my identity. But in terms of in that context, I rejected a lot of my culture growing up because I felt the need to be successful and to be acquainted to in America and the States, you had to reject where you originally came from. And over time, as I had to rediscover myself after towards the end of high school and after coming here for college, I kind of realized that's not necessarily the case, that those are not mutually exclusive concepts, that you can have both, that you can be successful and still make your living and your life here in the United States in a global superpower, but still knowing where you're from. And it's kind of being a back and forth between knowing that and being acquainted here, along with the idiosyncrasies of being Afro-Latino and being Dominican, and having a lot of African influences because it's a Caribbean country that was affected by the African slave trade, let's say Trinidad, but also still being part of Latin America. So it's really just a lot of intersectionality. I think intersectionality would probably be the best way to describe it. I
think that's a major point that you mentioned, intersectionality, because a lot of times, before I guess you get educated and come into college, you kind of see white and black, and you see a reflection of other people. I remember the first time I met you, you told me actually was like, I'm from Dominican Republic, and I was like, I've never met anyone from Dominican Republic.
Yeah.
What's kind of like the thing? And he's like, well, I'm black, but I speak Spanish. And I remember that stuck with me for a while, because a lot of the times we will think, okay, like, he looks very African American, looks very black, but the discussion on like culture is kind of like interesting, because while you said you do look black, but you don't feel like you're a part of that African American.
Well, no, I think I still consider myself part of the black community.
Yeah.
Because another thing I was gonna.
But it's different.
Yeah,
you know,
it is different.
You're part of it, but you're a little different.
I was gonna mention that, like, another thing, like what you just said, you never met any Dominicans here, right? That also has to play in that most of us and most of the Caribbean population, like when it comes to like Puerto Rico and Cuba as well, are more found in the Northeast, in states like New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and as well as Florida gets an honorable mention, because there's a huge Cuban and like a large Latinx melting pot in like Miami and other places in Florida. But anyway, yeah, you usually find it on the East Coast, and the West Coast is obviously more Central American in terms of demographics. And so when I came here, that affected my experience in terms of like adapting, because I was basically one of the only ones who could relate to that experience, versus like everyone else being either Mexican, Salvadoran, Guatemalan, or so on and so forth.
And South American.
Yeah, lots of South Americans as well. So I kind of had to like, that's another thing that kind of forced me or made me want to rediscover who I was in my culture, especially after like so many years when I was a kid having to reject it. So I think that's like one of those like wake up calls that sometimes people get, where like you want to embrace that thing that you probably didn't know very much about growing up. And yeah, and since there aren't many Dominicans here in California as a state, it's put me in the position where I'd have to like explain a little bit just like what that is. But you know, I think over time it's gotten like easier, but also people are becoming like more, how would you say, like open to that type of ideas, because USC is a pretty diverse school.
Yeah.
To give it credit for, both in terms of internationally and just like of people within the country.
Well, I just think, like you said, you know, intersectionality and all that, where the world's becoming very much more diverse.
And the world's becoming smaller too.
Exactly. So. And you see like, you know, a lot of like, I guess like, biracial people, mixed people.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and I would say,
and we're all mixed, really.
I would say, yeah, like, you know, like the Latin community, like just look at me and Justin right now, like we look very different, but we like the same kind of music, we speak the same languages, and we have very similar cultural ties. And you know, as the world becomes more diverse, you're gonna see more intersectionality between that, where I feel like yourself and maybe to some extent like other Latin Americans can kind of like have that intersectionality and are the first ones to deal with that right now.
Yeah.
But you know, yeah, I answered a couple of the questions I already had written down, but
it's okay. You can. There were some other things.
It's fine. Let's just go to the next one.
Yeah.
All right. What differentiates the Dominican Republic from other Latin countries, besides, you know, the similar color scheme? Because this kind of looks like another one of the countries we got.
Yeah, red, white, and blue. Ironically, that's my flag, but it's Mexican Independence Day. But
hey, I wanted you to feel included.
I feel that. So let me see. Honestly, this is one of those situations where I wish I probably have been like traveled more to other Latin American countries, like Mexico or Cuba or Colombia.
Well, you know, Mexico is just down there. We can go.
Of course. But in terms of like compare and contrast, let's say, well, obviously, I don't know if you know, but the dance and music of bachata originated in my country.
Bachata.
So we basically created most of that, and that comes more from the Caribbean. Other dances like salsa and merengue, I think, are like not wide or well known, but like Cubans tend to take a lot of ownership or a lot of influence over salsa, especially in New York. But there are also different types of salsa in New York than in LA. They dance slightly differently from what I know. I'm sure like you grew up dancing a little merengue too, right?
You know, it's interesting
in your
enough.
household?
No, I remember we would dance a certain dance, but my family's my dad's from the north, and they kind of have their own thing, which is called banda. It's a little different, but you know, I think like living in Los Angeles, you do get that interplay between different nationalities where you do see it and you kind of pick it up. but the tough part is like you don't actually know the name of it, you know?
Right.
There's a couple of like Spanish songs that I'm pretty sure a lot of people have heard at parties, and once they hear it, they kind of feel like, oh yeah, like I know what that is, but they don't know the actual name of it.
Yeah, that's comes back to the issue I was talking about like feeling that tension and conflict in terms of identity. This is extremely common. I think there was another dance that was, I think, Salvadoran or Central American.
So do you feel more like the Dominican Republic is not just different from these Latin countries, it's different because it's Caribbean? You know, you keep mentioning Puerto Rico and Cuba.
I think because
so do you feel like a closer affinity to those
countries as Cuba? Well, yes. I mean, in terms of like just in terms of proximity, we're more similar to Cuba, Puerto Rico than let's say, you know, Guatemala or Honduras. Even though, you know, we obviously have similarities across Latin America, like between Spanish language and Spanish colonization and Catholicism.
Yes.
But in terms of differentiation, well, I don't know if you know what Santeria is.
Santeria?
Santeria. It's something like I mean, I knew about it growing up, but I just delved more into it just because I wanted to relearn and see what it was about. But it's like this religious system, religious practice in some Latin American countries, especially in Dominican Republic. But and also Mexico and Cuba as well, but not necessarily in other ones. And that has a lot of influence of Spanish Catholicism, and it's supposed to be where you pray to one God, but you also believe in spirits that worship that God, like deities.
Yeah.
So it stems from Catholicism. But the really interesting thing is, that I just learned, is that originally, before it was influenced by Spanish Catholicism and colonization, it had a basis in a lot of African roots, traditions, and rituals. So when African slave trade was brought here to the Caribbean, they were mainly a lot of black people brought in from West African countries like Nigeria specifically. And then, but when they came here, you know, a lot of African rituals and traditions weren't exactly allowed, and they were persecuted for it. So as a way to kind of like subvert that and for a lot of African slaves to survive, they also had to like change it up a bit. And then when the Spanish conquered them and, you know, all that intermixing happened, it became even more integrated. So it's basically a lot of African rituals and like Nigerian traditions that were then like consumed and influenced by Spanish Catholicism. So it's a religious practice, but that's a perfect example how like the intermixing between the European and the African came about in countries like Dominican Republic and Cuba. And I don't think that's necessarily found across all Latin American countries. Like I doubt that you probably found that in like Argentina. One of the things. And that's one of the things I saw when I went back over the summer and like went to a church and saw a bunch of paintings, and I thought that was really interesting because I'd always seen that growing up in like murals and artwork and like stuff that, you know, like my mom like necessarily talked about, but since I didn't like try to embrace it or take any interest in the religion, I never thought about it until now. So that's just one way I'd say I differentiate it.
You know, once you said it's more spiritual, I got the fact that it was African in sense. You know, my last guest, if you guys did see the episode last week, was Christian, and he talked a little
Game day. Love that, man.
You know, he was here and he talked a little bit more about what it was to be West African and to be Ghanaian, and he talked a lot about that spirituality. So it's great to see that, you know, despite the fact that these people were displaced and forced to, you know, come to these countries and, you know, horrible conditions and horrible things that have happened to them, they were able to, you know, find a way to mingle it with what was required of them to learn, you know. So it's interesting to see that stem from there, going to the Dominican Republic and seeing you knowing what it is right now.
Yeah, honestly, like one of my bucket list activities is to go on like a tri-continental trip between not only go back to DR, then take directly a trip to Spain, and then from there go to Africa, and specifically West Africa, and spend like an entire summer, or if not like at least a few weeks there, in all 3 different continents to try to see all the different influences of where I come from. Just because of all the intermixing influences after I went back. So that's a bit of a dream of mine.
That sounds like an amazing thing. So let's talk business later. No, I'm just kidding. So, you know, we talked a little bit about these differences, and, you know, differences make us who we are, but they also play a part in how we look at ourselves, right? So how does, you know, the differences between you as a Dominican versus other Latinos, how does that make you feel?
I would say, I mean, in Western culture, individualism is highly valued. So I guess in a way it could be placed as as a good thing in a lot of ways. I mean, most people here, since there aren't as many Dominicans here, most people would see it as a cool thing. Like, oh, Afro-Latino is kind of a commodity, versus on the East Coast, where it's much more common and kind of people kind of know what's up. So, you know, it's almost like it allows you to be a different person, if you will. But yeah, going on, I think it affects especially the social experience of being Latino, because if you look, let's say traditionally indigenous, in terms of like indigenous Mexican or Guatemalan, or like typically, you know, like Central American, South American Latino, which is more perpetuated and represented in the media, then it works differently than if you were to be Caribbean Latino, which is virtually completely non-existent when you turn on your TV or your...
So when we talk about like, I guess like prevalence, you know, we've had conversations about, you know, one culture being more prevalent in the media than others.
Yeah.
Do you think that that prevalence could be a good thing or a bad thing? Because there's a lot of times where blame is assumed to a certain group of people just because they're the majority in, let's say, a country.
I'm sorry, repeat that?
So do you feel like, since you're like in this state, in this side of the country where there's not a lot of Dominicans, right? There's a lot of like stuff in the media that's targeting towards people from Central America and South America. And then since you are Latino, you're kind of grouped in that, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that sometimes being prevalent in media or not being prevalent in media has an effect on how you kind of like look at towards your culture?
Well, yeah, I mean, first off, there's not, in terms of our contemporary moment and the context, because of Trump's administration and the state that the country is in, immigration policy has always been on the forefront for the last few years, and that has obviously mainly affected Central America. So considering, you know, the border is right next door, so of course those countries are going to be more talked about in the media because those are just more relevant in terms of policy right now. And I mean, as much as I hate to say it, you know, a lot of negative and bad rhetoric has affected people from those communities. So you're going to see them a lot more. So in that case, I mean, even though it's good to be aware of, you know, these aren't exactly the issues that we want to have, but you are going to hear more about issues affecting those communities. But because of representation, you're obviously going to know more about those type of Latinos, whether you perceive them in a good way or a bad way, you know they're there. Latinos who necessarily look like me aren't always seen or exactly embraced in forms of media, and that's one of the things that I definitely want to work on, being a cinema and media studies major, because hopefully I want to be in a position of influence one day where I can change that and add more representation for communities of color that I would have wanted growing up, and that I think a lot of people probably don't see, like the Afro-Latino community or the Caribbean community. And like out of the Caribbean, I think a lot the people that are probably most well known is like Puerto Rico, because they are U.S. territory, but not necessarily as much Dominican Republic, which is also like kind of understandable. But again, that could be viewed in a bad light or good light. Publicity isn't always good publicity, to answer your question. But all I will say is that being represented is important, and seeing yourself represented is important. And I think most people want to have that. And it just makes you feel like you know, are capable of achieving something when you see someone else doing that.
You just want to be seen.
Of course, everyone wants to be seen. That's basically it.
So we've had many conversations regarding Latin identity. How do you feel the shifts in terms of world proximity, such as West versus East Coast? You know, like you mentioned, you're from New York. A lot of other Caribbean / Afro-Latinos are from the East Coast. And then here in the West Coast, it's mostly Central Americans, South Americans. You know, how is like that dynamic change from East versus West? Yeah,
I mean, I already touched upon this question a little bit earlier, but I'll also say, obviously the demographics here in LA are slightly different than back home. And for a second, I know freshman year, it took me a while to get acquainted with that. But I'd say Latino culture has its own, how do I say this?
Well, maybe if I format this question again, it'll be better. You know, how has the shift from East to West been? What have you noticed, and how have you adapted?
It's been relatively fun. I mean, I love the West Coast. I know I wanted to move out of New York and go away for college for a while, so that's why I decided. I knew I didn't want to like stay in the city, and that's not necessarily like go to NYU, which was basically my second option.
Yeah.
And USC was my dream school for a while, so I definitely.
Another thing we share in common.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely wanted to move out here. I think a lot of people share that sentiment wanting to come here. And the West Coast is obviously a great place to be. I think the climate reminds me a little bit more of back home in Santo Domingo than, you know, the cold winters in New York do. So it's also been nice. Basically, the biggest obstacles, I just said, is like, it's almost like moving to a new place, like you would like when you were growing up as a kid. And basically just like taking a while to adapt and acclimate. And I realized that sometimes that takes longer. Like usually it can take like a year or so for you to get exactly like used to a city. Don't expect to get used to it like just a few months, because it's not only like the people and the culture and like the school, but it's also an entirely new home, and like being like on a different coast, it will be a slightly different culture. And I realized you have to give that time, and you shouldn't rush things, because at first I did want to rush it when I was like getting used to a freshman year. And honestly, like it wasn't until I think some point in sophomore year really where I feel like I actually became more of like a resident, or I started considering LA more of a home. And I will admit it took me a while, but like that's just something that you shouldn't try to expect too much of, you know what I mean? But back to the other part of your question, I think back in the East Coast, I think Latino culture has its own like hub of its own that's slightly different, because over there reggaeton is bigger, but that's also because Puerto Ricans were the ones that like originally pioneered reggaeton, and then we also helped, and that started in New York. And because so much culture and so much like variety started in New York, including hip hop, which was born in the Bronx, there's so much variety that people is just like more open to that stuff. And I feel like reggaeton and Latin music has become so big now that like it's definitely finally like moving to the West Coast, and you even see it here. But I remember like in high school when Bad Bunny and other artists like Nicky Jam were like breaking up, we would used to hear that in the Heights all the time. And like reggaeton and like basically Latin trap, as it's called now, I feel like was originally like more open over there than it was here, because it was born over there, of course. So I feel like that, you know, Latino culture is more like embraced because of the variety of the Latino culture over there. As well, I will say that I think Black culture and Latino culture are also close over there because of pure proximity, because a lot of Latinos there tend to be Caribbean. So there's more embrace between, you know, African American culture.
I think it's more of like a connection, right? Because like we talked about this, where you can kind of like do both, right? You can be in BSA, you can be in LSA. That's kind of more of like, I don't know, like be like cultural, I guess, cultural affinity,
in a way,
right?
Yeah.
Here, like I've mentioned this to like my friend from New Jersey
the racial
too,
dichotomy
it's
is
more of like proximity, you know, like we get along because we share the same struggles, you know?
Yeah.
We're both minorities, and we're both
that
going
definitely
through,
applies in New York too.
you know, like, you know, a society that's historically bent towards a certain demographic, right? You know, so that's our common struggle, is what puts us together in our proximity.
Yeah.
You know, but yeah, like I believe that one of the reasons why you guys love Latin trap is because you guys are making it. You know?
Yeah.
I'm just saying, you gotta be a Mexican Latin trap artist. Got a big market, needs to get on that.
It's getting bigger, that's for sure.
But you know, let's shift a little bit more to recent events. You know, I just understood that you just went back to the Dominican Republic. You went back home.
Yeah, after 5 years.
After 5 years.
Yeah, it was a while.
How was your trip back? You know, like
honestly,
walk us through it.
It was only about 2 weeks or so. So it wasn't very long, contrary to what you might believe. But it's honestly, I did so much with my family in just a short time span that it felt longer. So like honestly, I would consider that more like the highlight of about half my summer. But first off, I haven't been there in a while. I hadn't been since about sophomore year of high school. So I basically hadn't seen some of my uncles and some of my grandparents for a while. But what I love so much is that I went back, it was like I had never left. You know, it's like I had like left just a few months ago rather than just a few years.
Wow.
You know, they welcomed me with like open arms, and like it was great to see, like obviously I had grown up and I was very different than like how they knew me before, because I wasn't exactly a kid anymore. But they also like changed a little bit, mainly referring to my uncles, because they're both around like their early 30s or so. And you know, as a kid, you don't necessarily see see a few things that you start to notice growing up. And like, you know, they both have the careers. My uncle had 2 kids. He's married now.
Wow.
And stuff like that. I got to meet his wife, who was like with us for a lot of our trips, and she's like amazing, and like she's great. And like my other uncle, he works in STEM. He's a network manager, and he's also a professor at this public university in Santo Domingo, and like has become fairly successful with his career. And it was just like stuff that I never even knew about. So like, I mean, I thought I was busy here in college. I was like, I thought I was stressed, but they were grinding for a while, and it was just amazing to see them like develop their own lives as like adults, and to see something more that I can understand now at the age of 19 that I would have been able to when I was like younger.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
You know, I don't want to keep bringing up Christian, but you know, when he talked about going back to Ghana, he said that one of the things, you know, a lot of people would be shocked about is that, you know, you kind of have like, or like, I guess like sometimes the media here kind of like puts an image of a certain country in your head, you know?
Yeah,
and like you're seeing your uncles being successful, and maybe like subconsciously you're like, wow, like, you know, like I thought like people left here to have a better life, but here they are.
That's
succeeding,
still true, but yeah,
you know?
no, honestly, it's a how would you say, a two-edged sword or whatnot?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You know? So I would think the same thing, you know?
Yeah, of course.
And when you go there and you see like all the success and all that that's different, you're kind of like, wow, like I have been brainwashed in a way, you know?
No, it's honestly true. It's so true. And don't get me wrong, Dominican Republic is still practically a third world country in a lot of ways, but you know, because there's such a lack of infrastructure in so much of Latin America, and because of its history of dictatorship, and we just got out of its dictatorship about 5 decades ago, in the 1960s.
Wow.
Like, and 50 years is nothing when you think about it. So you can still feel a lot of the influence of that dictatorship that was in the mid 20th century, because that lasted for 3 decades with Trujillo. And one of the funny things from my trip is that we went to like a few museums and stuff like that. And my grandfather, who's about like almost hitting his 70s now, who grew up early on in the dictatorship, would like tell me stories about, you know, oh, there were riots here, or Trujillo was assassinated here, or there was like another like uproar and politically in this neighborhood and stuff like that. And it was so cool because, you know, again, like before when I was growing up, I never taken any interest in stuff like that, and I never like even bothered to know my own history. And then going back to try to rediscover where I come from, like I had my grandpa there to like teach me and show me like what he had seen like so long ago, like 2 generations back before me, and that was like really cool. But yeah, like despite it being a third world country, what was really funny, like we were driving like downtown in the capital city, and we saw sports cars and like Lambos, and obviously tourism is the biggest source of the economy in Dominican Republic, because you know the Caribbean is known as paradise. So a lot of rich people from Europe and other like first world countries tend to come here and maybe even bring a lot of their stuff and like own condos for vacation homes and stuff like that. So that's very common. But like people don't think that you would see maybe a Ferrari going downtown in Dominican Republic, or you'd see like all these like fairly successful people here, even though maybe those cars belong to like a famous baseball player or whatever, because you know baseball is a sport, but that is still there. So it's really like 2 sides of the same coin, and it's very multi-dimensional that not everyone like sees. So that's a big part of it.
You know, let's just get to it. How do you think being Dominican has shaped the kind of person you are today?
Let me see.
Take a second, think about it. It's all good.
I guess I could just try to culminate in like a summary of like everything I've already said, and like how it's like shaped who I'm trying to be and the person I'm becoming. I think after going back, I've learned to think a little more like globally in a sense, because
but we are global citizens, right?
Yeah, of course. And like just to think about, after learning a little more about colonization, not only back home but here like at USC, about the Spanish Empire, about like basically how the world works and is formed today between different countries, and globalization that's become like a growing like concept and topic over the last few years as the world becomes smaller and smaller. I think it's like really made me think of like how I can handle who I am and the intersectionality of being Dominican American here at a prestigious American university, and Latino, and managing my blackness all at the same time, and not just limiting that to an American context. Versus I can be a Latino or also be perceived as a black man globally, and how that interweaves into my social experience, like how people like see me in like other countries, which I hope to visit in the future, and just like me also being bilingual in Spanish is also a part of it, and me wanting to like retain my language, which I did not want to do growing up, because I hated speaking Spanish growing up. Like I hated it, and I think a lot of Latinos resonate with that, and I understand, because language is a very difficult thing to do and to manage, and not a lot of us are brought up in a way where we learn to embrace and we're taught the white way how to, you know, utilize both.
Of course.
So I think I can take it as a form of pride to try to retain and be bilingual and know my language, which goes back to me like saying like you can be Americanized, you can be successful and do what you want here and form your life like in a new country while still knowing where you come from. And I think that's a big part of like what I've learned to try to embrace, you know, and try to like be part of multiple worlds, because no one's like one-dimensional at all.
Of course.
You shouldn't limit yourself.
So, you know, in a long story put short, he's not one-dimensional. He's multi-dimensional.
Okay.
So that,
Gassing me up.
I got to make sure more people come on the show.
For sure.
You know, I'm really glad that we had this conversation and we were able to extend it to the viewers. You know, we always had this conversation about identity and race, and you know how that always plays a part in who we are today. But I'm really glad that you were able to, you know, tell people what it is being Dominican. You know, you did go back to Dominican Republic. Your parents actually just came the other day.
Yeah, they're here this weekend.
Is there anything you want the audience to know about the Dominican Republic, or maybe like a little bit about your culture? Some things that they might not know, because you know, like you said, you know, there's not a lot of Dominicans out here. So
yeah, I mean, if you know me, you know I'm always trying to advocate for La Patria. So I won't shut up about it sometimes, but
that's why you're on. That's why you're on.
So specifically, I mean, I told you about Santeria. I told you about bachata, Spanish colonies, stuff like that. I ironically can't think of anything specifically right now, but just know that, I mean, all I'll say is Latinidad is not mutually exclusive with blackness, and the two concepts can go hand in hand. And you can have white Latinos, you can have black Latinos. I've even heard you can have Asian Latinos. So honestly,
I told you, man. My buddy from Puerto Rico. I may hope to get him on soon. Hope to get him on.
I hope to meet him.
Yeah. So
honestly, like always, like be open-minded, and that more of the world is out there, and I'm like living proof of that. So if you ever have any questions, feel free to ask me later.
I guess we'll drop his info in the bio. No, yeah, you know, that's the whole point of starting the show, is to kind of address that. You know, there's a lot of different cultures, ethnicities, traditions, a lot of things that are meant to be discovered. And you know, I was kind of looking for a little bit more, you know, like reasons to go check out the Dominican Republic, you know, maybe some like Dominican culture. Because I remember you said, I think it's Maluma, right?
Maluma?
Who's from the Dominican Republic and does music?
Osuna?
Osuna, that's who it is. I apologize.
He's actually half Dominican, but I like to claim him.
Claim him.
I like to claim him.
Claim him.
Puerto Ricans have enough already. They have Bad Bunny, like, come on.
Yeah. Now. So, you know, that, you know, go visit the Dominican Republic, but...
Not Punta Cana. That's so Americanized. Like, beautiful. I'm so sad. That's not even DR, bro. I swear, it's just a resort.
That's Justin Soto. That's Justin Soto discovering Senate. Sorry. I'll do it again. That's the power of editing, right?
Yeah, it is.
Channel 2.
All right, keep going.
Discover with Justin Soto Garcia on the Dominican Republic. That is The Truth Within. Catch us next week as we have another person from abroad to talk about their culture, their traditions, and their own self-discovery. I'd like to thank my special guest, Justin Soto, my special producer who helped me out very last minute, Kristen. So thank you very much. Till next week. Thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.